Welcome to the Clinical Podcast Series brought to you by the American Academy of Optometry Foundation. The topic for this episode is comparing 10-2 and 24-2C grids to identify central field defects. And now I'd like to introduce our host, Gretchyn Bailey, our topical expert, Dr. Jack Fu, and our topical editor, Dr. Andrew Rixon. Without further ado, over to our experts.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gretchyn Bailey. I'm a fellow of the American Academy of Optometry, and I'm talking today with Jack Fu in Sydney, Australia. He's also a fellow of the Academy, and he's a diplomate in the glaucoma section. Jack, thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thanks, Gretchyn. Great to be here.
We are talking about a study comparing 10-2 and 24-2C test grids for identifying central visual field defects in glaucoma and suspect patients. And that's actually the title of this paper. And you are the lead author on this paper, you and a couple of colleagues. And this paper was published in, AJO. So tell me a little bit about this study.
Yeah, thanks, Gretchyn. So this study came as a result of us having just bought a new Humphrey Field Analyzer version 3. And with the version 3, they came with new software that released the 24-2C test grid, which was advertised by Zeiss to be potentially useful for identifying central visual field defects, whilst not having to do a separate test grid altogether like the traditional 10-2. So basically, the 24-2C having those extra points in the standard 24-2 might be able to shed some light on the central visual field. And so that's where my colleagues and I were particularly interested in to see and compare the utility of this for describing central visual field defects in patients with glaucoma and those glaucoma suspects as well.
What does the C in 24-2C mean? And what's the relevance and why does it matter?
Yeah, so the C is indicative of the additional 10 test locations added to the central visual field across the 24-2 test grid. So normally the 24-2 test grid are test locations that are uniformly spaced 6 degrees apart, covering both a couple of the central points, but also primarily the peripheral test locations in areas that are relevant for glaucoma, like your nasal steps, your arcuates, and your paracentrals. But recognizing that the central visual field is also very important for a lot of patients with glaucoma, Zeiss developed the C test grid, which takes and puts an additional 10 points in the central visual field. Now, what's unique about these 10 points is that they're not uniformly distributed, they're actually asymmetrically distributed, covering an almost arc-like pattern that's quite commonly seen in patients with glaucoma. And so the particular theory is that by adding those 10 locations in, we might be able to detect more instances of central visual field defects. That's where the C comes from.
Gotcha. That's a great explanation. Thank you. So what did your study results show?
So I'd like to highlight 2 main points that are relevant to practicing clinicians. The first point is when we compared the global indices, so the common indices that we might use for visual field interpretation, like mean deviation, pattern standard deviation, and this metric called mean sensitivity, which just reflects the patient's visual sensitivity within the central visual field. And when we compared them between the 24-2C and the 10-2, we actually found very similar results and very high correlations, which basically means that they both perform similarly well in identifying mean deviation defects, pattern standard deviation, and mean sensitivity. So based on that first outcome, we were thinking, okay, well, maybe the 24-2C is pretty good at looking at these sort of global metrics of visual field interpretation. But our second analysis was a little bit more fine-tuned. We looked at the individual test points now. So we counted the number of test points within central visual field that were defective. And then what we did is we also superimposed these central test locations onto a macular OCT scan to perform structure function correlations. Because as clinicians, when we're looking for patients with glaucoma, we really want to identify those that have structure function concordance. It makes us a lot more confident that this patient has a defect there. And what we found was that the 10-2 tended to have numerically more and proportionally more central visual field defects identified in comparison to the 24-2C. The reason why I say proportionally is because the 10-2 tests a lot more test points, so we had to scale it back and make sure that we were comparing sort of similar metrics. But even proportionally, the 10-2 was doing a lot better. And more importantly, though, when we did our structure function correlations, we found that the 10-2 had a favorable outcome in identifying more instances of structure function concordance in comparison to 24-2C. And so practically speaking, the 10-2 gives not only a bit more information about defects, but also can give information that helps a clinician gain more confidence in the diagnosis and management plan.
That's a very important point that you said there about gaining more confidence, and those are very interesting results. Thank you so much for sharing those with us today, Jack.
Thanks, Gretchyn.
And a special thanks to CooperVision for their educational grant to make it all happen.